my block and now the cops are stopping me. I said, what you doing here? Like, why you trying to talk to me? I said, officer, what am I doing wrong? Let me get just what I came for, I really won't be long. When I told him I had children, he was looking at me differently. Doing what I'm doing, why he gotta clench his fist at me. I came about the dirt, but they still mad cause of my history. I'ma keep on going to the top until they sick of me. Steady protest, but I don't even see a change. Always hearing BLM, but is it really in your brain? Gotta see what's going on, cause we ain't all treated the same. Why so serious? I'm furious, cause this is not no game.
And I'd like to welcome you back to NBWA, New Brunswickers Want Action. I'm your host, Neil Clements, and I'd like to welcome my co-host, Mr. Matthew Martin, and Dr. Timothy Christie. Welcome back, Dr. Christie. We've been very consistent in this show as it regards the outcomes that we've been calling for. One of the outcomes that we've been calling for is the criminalization of racial discrimination. A further outcome that we've been calling for is the inclusion of Black history education in the formal curriculum in New Brunswick. And another inquiry, which we've talked about extensively, is a public inquiry using a whole of government approach to study systemic discrimination in the province of New Brunswick. To date, there's been some new activity on the front of that last outcome. That is the public inquiry as a whole of government approach into systemic discrimination. Matthew, I'm sure you can agree this is exciting news. Why don't you help us out and provide a little perspective on that?
Yeah, so a few weeks ago, Black Lives Matter New Brunswick was given funding to do a research into Black systemic racism in New Brunswick. And then this week we received an announcement from the government as well that there'll be a commission put together and designed to take a look at systemic racism in a province. Now, what exactly this commission looks like and who that commissioner will be right now hasn't been decided, as they'll do an application process, and from there it'll be decided by the Executive Council who that commissioner will be. But we do know that something is going to be done in systemic racism, and they're taking an approach of looking at every racialized community and being very broad and trying to find exactly what it looks like, and then at the end of the year provide a report with some recommendations for what the government can do to address systemic racism.
That's exciting. Now, I know, Dr. Christie, you and I talked about this earlier, and I think one of the questions the public's going to have is we've been talking about a public inquiry, and this is a commission. What's the difference?
That's an important question, Neil. So a public inquiry is a legally mandated investigation, and they are usually into a very specific fact situation, so maybe a police shooting or some form of corruption in government or something. So they usually have a very specific mandate to investigate a situation, and there could even be a criminal element there. So as a result, the inquiry have the power to subpoena people. They force people to testify under oath. They can subpoena documents. So they have a lot of investigative powers that are supported by legislation and law to conduct their inquiry. So it's really the highest standard, the most rigorous standard we have. Normally, like I said, they're into specific events, but you could have a public inquiry into a broad policy thing. So in New Brunswick, we could have a public inquiry into systemic racism if we wanted to. The commission approach is different. So the commission is probably not going to have the powers to subpoena people. It's probably not going to have the powers to require people to testify under oath. And it's not clear that a commission needs those powers to do its work. So here, my understanding from the press releases that I've read and the things I've seen online and the interviews I've watched is that this commissioner is going to be given broad powers to conduct an investigation or a study into systemic racism in New Brunswick, and there doesn't seem to be any restrictions on the commissioner. So the commissioner has not been told what departments you're allowed to look at and which ones you're not. So presumably,
Whole of government.
They might have the power, the discretion to look at a whole of government. They have not been restricted, so maybe they could even look at some private entities as opposed to just government ones. There's no restriction that is only New Brunswick focused, so looks like they have the opportunity to do an international literature review and that type of thing. So I appreciate that we've been calling for a public inquiry. And like I said, that is really the highest standard of rigor to make sure. But I think there are merits to this commission approach. It looks like it will be broad enough to be able to do a lot of the work that we want the commissioner to do. So I think from my perspective, I'm not ready to prejudge anything yet.
Sure.
I understand it's not exactly what we've been asking for, but I don't think we should let perfection be the enemy of the good. This looks like it could be a very productive endeavor, but of course, anything can be done well or it can be done badly. So a lot is going to depend on this particular commissioner.
And I think the importance being, and you said perfection, and it says in the Bible that we are to strive for perfection, knowing we'll never get there. But I think the important aspect here is that it's happening. ×2 in the province of New Brunswick for the first time ever, that type of an analysis.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. So this government, the Conservative government, and I'm by no means a member of any political party, and when it comes to politicians, I look at the person and the ideas of the person, not really who their affiliation is. But this government did make a public statement in the Legislative Assembly where they said, we're going to move on from the conversation of whether systemic racism and discrimination exist to say it exists. We concede it exists. Now our government are going to say we're going to spend the rest of our mandate addressing it.
Wonderful.
And they did that by funding the BLM and NBCC study, and now making an announcement that they're going to contribute $500,000 to supporting this commissioner in their work.
Wow. I think that's amazing in a historical context, because several episodes ago we gave a backdrop to the history of the Conservative Party and the racist roots of the party. So to see, for me, this is a big move for that party. And again, I'm not a party person either, but to see them jumping into the present and not being obvious about their history and changing their history, I'm really excited about that.
And we all agree that this could be a very good approach.
Absolutely.
But there's a lot of critique around it as well. Different organizations and different groups are saying, this project is too broad. They're not looking at anything specifically enough. We're also seeing in the media that different organizations are upset that they weren't consulted on how the commission should happen, if it should have happened at all. We're also seeing a lot that this approach is very colonial and very racist way to go forward with this commission.
Matthew, I think the challenge with the detractors to these activities, especially with the commentary relative to colonialism, is that the province of New Brunswick is becoming very diverse, and there's not just only one group that we're dealing with, which is why I believe the government is looking at this commission as a whole of government approach, dealing, like your study, which we'll talk about later, deals with the black community, and the government's commission, I believe, Dr. Christie, deals with all racialized communities in the province. Am I correct with that statement?
That's correct, Neil. With the government, I think the initiative they're doing of a commission is very constructive. I think it's going to be productive. But we're not apologists for the government here. We're not going to be speaking for them or trying to rationalize what they're doing. But from my perspective, I see that they have a long-term growth strategy of bringing 7,500 new people a year to New Brunswick and trying to retain 85% of them. That is only going to be done through immigration. So what they have to do is make it so that this province is welcoming to everybody. So we have communities in this province that have suffered centuries of injustice, and nobody can discount that. Nobody can take that away. It's absolutely true. And that needs to be rectified. And there's mechanisms that they have, maybe they work, maybe they don't, like the Truth and Reconciliation approach, where they're working on that. But this government, I think, also has to say we have to make the place safe for everybody. So if we're bringing 7,500 new people a year here, we need to make it so that they are not scared to send their kids to school. They are not scared to be stopped by the police. They are not scared to go to the hospital if they need something. So this approach, the commission approach, I think is saying this is a huge problem, and this problem is spread throughout New Brunswick. It's endemic in our society. And it looks like they're saying we want someone to take a look at all of it. And one thing I appreciate about this is that it doesn't seem to be political, where they are just catering to one group or another group, or making one group look okay. And quite frankly, all of us suffer racism on a daily basis, to different degrees, to different extents. We have different histories. You know, there's a history for Indigenous people through residential schools and the way that they tried to kill them and steal their land.
Cultural genocide, yeah.
Cultural genocide, exactly. With us, we have histories of slavery and the way. So everyone's got different histories. But what I do think with this government is they're saying we can't fix history, even though history is important, but we are going to try to do something. So they're going to put in a commissioner that has broad responsibilities, and saying to this person, now do your work and give us a report with recommendations.
And I think, if I might, and not to speak, I mean, who knows who this person will be, but I'm praying, if that means anything to anybody out there in TV land, it means something to me, that this commissioner that's brought on is able to have perspective of a member of a racialized community, because it is different. And I hope you understand that. Your comments on that, Matthew?
I'd say, you know, for that commissioner, they would definitely need to be an individual who has experienced racism and discrimination. For me, if that person who is looking into these issues has not experienced them, they, again, don't really know what they're looking for. I think that's part of our issue in society today, is our white community are trying to solve an issue that they don't really know what it looks like, and issues that they've created.
Good point, Matthew. Dr. Christie, anything further on that point?
I think so. I know I've had conversations with some people, and they will say things to me like, how do you define racism? What is the definition of racism? What's your operating definition of systemic racism? And I say, look, for those of us who experience it, and those of us who go through the trauma of having to cope with it and live with it and deal with it, we don't care what the definition is. So we don't have to define something in order to say it's real. The experiences we have are the reality. So people can look at a definition and try to say, if I can define it, and the people looking for definitions are people not experiencing it.
Exactly. Well, they need a definition.
So this commissioner should not be someone engaged in the esoteric activity of trying to define things like racism or systemic discrimination, but someone who knows what it is, and they can get to work trying to figure out how to address it in the province.
Perfect. And I would agree 100%. And to the detractors out there who would suggest that it needs to be this, it needs to be that, we need to change this, let's all just celebrate for a moment that the province of New Brunswick has recognized that there is a disparity in our experience when it comes to equality in the justice system, the health system, social development, in the education system. I'm celebrating that they are recognizing that disparity.
But you know, guys, I don't mean to interrupt, but there's something I think that's important that we need to emphasize, is that this commissioner is going to start off with really nothing to work with. In New Brunswick, we do not capture any specific race-related data. We don't know specifically health outcomes or outcomes and social determinants of health or education outcomes for any of our ethnic groups in the province. So they've given this commissioner a very tight timeline, 1 year. They want a report and recommendations by the end of the year next year, by the end of March 2022. However, the person has nothing to work with. They have no data to start with. So they're going to have to spend the first part of their mandate figuring out what that data is. And I think this is the brilliance of Matthew's project, is that they're already putting their mind to it. So they're going to develop a model that this commissioner can probably use to study a lot of other ethnic groups. So I think, Matthew, if you want to just explain about some of the work you're doing and the data you're collecting.
The main purpose of our project is to start establishing those benchmarks that are clearly lacking. So when we look at benchmarks, what we're trying to establish is a baseline for us to refer to. For example, if we take a look at our education sector, we want to look at, of all the students who have graduated, what proportion of those individuals are black. Now, from there, if we then refer to our population, we know that 1% of our New Brunswick population is black. So when we reference our population and we look at our outcomes, our benchmarks, we now want to see, does our population match our benchmarks. So if 1% of our population is black and 1% is graduating, then we know there's no issue there. Now, for example, if we take a look at our justice system and we look at our benchmark for our justice system, we want to look at of all individuals who have been convicted of a crime, how many of them are black. Again, based on our population, we should see a 1%. If we see a 5%, then we know that there's a problem somewhere in our justice system where we are seeing an overrepresentation of black individuals being convicted of crimes. The same as if we move to our social development department. Of all individuals who are using social assistance, what percentage of those individuals are black? We can then further that as well and look at our health system, and we can look at of all individuals who suffer from a mental health illness, what percentage of those individuals are black as well. So these benchmarks are really taking a look at what we know based off of our research that we will be performing and establishing compared to our population, taking those two numbers and finding out exactly where our black community sits in regards to the rest of the population.
So it would seem apparent to me that these two studies are going to work quite well together, and the data that you are presently collecting will be very useful in the Commission's work, since that data does not presently exist, and you can actually compare your data to get the real numbers, the real information. Dr. Christie, commentary on that?
No, you're absolutely correct, because what Matthew's project is doing is establishing the framework, the methodology. Now, once they have this for blacks, we can do it for Indigenous people, we can do it for Asians, we can do it for immigrants, we can do it for whomever we want. So the brilliance of their project is they're paving the way for this commissioner. Right now, like I said, this commissioner has nothing to work with and a very, very tight time frame. But the government just invested money in Matthew's study a couple of weeks ago, probably in anticipation that this type of work is going to need to be done. So even though Matthew's project is looking at blacks specifically, that analysis can be done for each group throughout once they've identified all of the benchmarks, which I think, once again, is going to be very innovative out of all jurisdictions in the country.
I would agree. It will be a template for other jurisdictions to follow, and I welcome that, and I congratulate you on the efforts, Matthew. Look, this commissioner, whomever they might be, and this commission, if we were to provide them with some advice about what's needed and what has to be done, Dr. Christie, we'll start with you. What kind of advice would you give this commission?
I think this commissioner is going to have a backbone. This person is appointed by government. They're going to be paid by government. They're probably going to serve at the pleasure of government.
Absolutely.
And they're going to have to get over it. They cannot do this job if you're trying to ingratiate yourself to people in power. The people in power are all Caucasian. They've never experienced racism in their life. You're going to have someone as a commissioner who's going to have to do this work, and you're going to have to communicate this to these people who really don't know what you're talking about. That means you have to call a spade. They don't have any experience here. They don't have any expertise here. They can't tell you how to do your job. So whoever that commissioner is going to be is going to have to be able to work with government, be able to communicate with government, be able to work with all of our community stakeholders and communicate with them. But at the end of the day, that person is going to have to say, if I'm going to do this project, I'm accountable for it, and I'm going to do it come hell or high water. And if you fire me because I'm doing a good job, I'll get over it.
And as we discussed, that person has to have a particular perspective of a black, brown, or Indigenous person, a person who has experienced racism in their lifetime, so they know what they're talking about, and when they can speak to these, speak to this challenge with an educated voice.
Exactly.
So, gentlemen, I want to thank you today. I found the information very informative. The show was very educational. I'm sure it was for our viewers, because this information isn't readily available, which is why the commission is starting and why Black Lives Matter is undertaking their study. But final thoughts, Matthew, on our discussion today?
Absolutely. I think I want to go back to what Dr. Kersey said in regards to, perfection. We can't let perfection stop something that's good. I think the commission, as well as the project that Black Lives Matter is undergoing, is something good. no one, it's never been done. There's no standard for it to be referred to, so it's easy to critique it of what it should look like. It's easy to say you should do it this way, but it's never been done. So we truly can't say how it should be done properly. The wheel hasn't been invented yet. So I think when we look at these benchmarks and we look at what the commission is embarking on, I think we need to remember that this is a first step of a very, very large issue that is multifaceted and so ingrained in society that we can't realistically approach it with the perfect method because, again, it's such a complex issue. You're better off, in my opinion, addressing it from many different angles and deconstructing it any way possible.
Excellent. And again, we did discuss how once you're done, you'll have a standard
Absolutely.
that can be used in other jurisdictions, which is incredible. Dr. Christie, final comments?
Yeah, well, along Matthew's lines, I think that the project they're doing is going to be very important because this commissioner is going to need a methodology.
Yes.
And that methodology is going to require data. And that data is not there. And like I said, this person is going to be on a very tight time frame, and they're going to have to figure out how to negotiate that with government. But more importantly, one of the things I want to say is there's been a lot of criticisms of this process in the media, and I fully appreciate them. And one of the things that's important to do is distinguish between process and outcome. So in terms of the process, how did the government do it? Well, we know there's lots of groups they didn't consult with. So I don't think they consulted with Indigenous people. I don't think they consulted with Black people. I don't think they consulted with Asian people. I don't think they consulted with immigrants. Okay, so they didn't consult. But that in itself might be a criticism in terms of the process they went through. But what they did, I think, is a good thing.
And there's still an opportunity throughout the commission to do these consultations.
Well, I think that's the commissioner is
Right.
going to have to do
Absolutely.
this type of work. And we have to remember, consulting with victims is one thing, but they're not the racists. They're not the ones perpetrating systemic racism
Agreed.
or racial discrimination. It's the others. And this commissioner is going to have to break through those barriers and those walls as well.
And that will be, I think that'll be difficult, but I'm very hopeful, and I know hope is not a plan, but I'm very excited to see how this commission is going to roll out. I'm very excited to see the data that you collect, which will assist that commission, I'm certain. Matthew, I want to thank you for your input today. The information that you provided was very valuable, and I think our viewers will have found it educational and informative. And Dr. Christie, I really appreciate your commentary on the commission and the commission versus public inquiry. Again, something that our viewers need to understand, the difference of. But if you have further questions and you want to talk to Dr. Christie or Mr. Martin, both of whom are very informed on these topics, feel free to reach out to us at NBWA@CHCO.TV. And if you have not just commentary, opinion, and you would like to maybe have our show focus on a subject of interest to you, wrapped around systemic discrimination, of course, which is the topic of our show, again, reach out to us at NBWA@CHCO.TV. I want to thank you for your time. I want to thank you for paying attention. Make it a great day and choose to win.